They thought the old Vermont house was just an inheritance. Dusty rooms, sagging floors, and nothing more than memories left behind. But in the attic, beneath rotting boards and mildew, they uncovered a locked suitcase that refused to open. When the clasp finally snapped, a smell of decay poured out, revealing photographs with scratched-out faces, coated ledgers, rusted pistols, and, buried deepest, a child's bones wrapped in cloth. Overnight, their dream home became a crime scene. What secrets had been hidden for nearly 50 years? And why had no one spoken to them until now? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The house had stood at the edge of town for longer than either of them could remember, its gabled roof breaking the line of maples that guarded the narrow road. Sarah and Daniel Whitaker had not expected to inherit it. The letter had arrived in a plain envelope. No return address. Only a lawyer's signature informing them that Sarah's great-uncle had left the property to her, a man she barely remembered from childhood holidays. They drove up from Boston on a cold Saturday, the kind of day when the sun made a brief appearance before clouds swallowed it whole. The place did not look inviting. Shutters hung askew, paint peeled in long strips from the siding, and the porch sagged in the middle as if it carried a weight it no longer wished to hold. The air smelled faintly of cedar and dampness, a reminder that no one had opened these windows for decades. They stepped to the front door, the sound of the hinges echoing through empty rooms lined with faded wallpaper. Dust floated in the beams of light like drifting snow, disturbed by their footsteps on wooden floors that groaned with every step. They spent most of the first afternoon moving from room to room, speaking in low voices that seemed swallowed by the size of the house. In the kitchen, they found a stove so old its enamel had cracked and curled. In the living room, shelves sagged beneath the weight of forgotten encyclopedias. Bedrooms upstairs smelled of mothballs and stale linen, beds still made with quilts that had yellowed in silence. Every corner carried the impression of lives halted mid-sentence. The attic was the last place they chose to see. A narrow staircase rose from the second-floor hallway. Steep and uneven, its banister rough beneath their hands. At the top, a hatch resisted before creaking open. Cold air spilled out carrying the odor of dust, wood rot, and something metallic that clung to the nose. Sarah went first, ducking her head to the opening, her flashlight beam sweeping across rafters where insulation had pulled away to reveal splintering beams. The space stretched wide, low at the sides where a roof met floor, tall at the center where a single bulb hung from a frayed cord that no longer carried power. Boxes were stacked in odd arrangements, their labels faded to smudges, their sides collapsing under decades of weight. Old trunks lined one wall, their leather cracked, brass corners green with corrosion. Cobwebs linked them together like strings on a forgotten instrument. Sarah brushed one aside with her sleeve, coughing as the dust rose. Daniel followed, his steps careful on the boards that flexed beneath his weight. They moved slowly, curious but cautious, afraid that the wrong step might break through the rooms below. It was in the far corner that Sarah noticed a sag. A section of floor near the eaves dipped slightly, as if it had been pressed down too often or had been hiding something heavy for too long. She crouched, running her fingers across the boards, feeling how soft they had become. Daniel joined her, shining the flashlight downward. The beam revealed the outline of a suitcase wedged between two beams, its canvas sides gray with dust, its handle stiff with rust. Neither of them spoke at first. The house had already carried the weight of abandonment, but this felt different. The suitcase seemed placed rather than forgotten, hidden rather than stored. Its presence shifted the air in the attic, turning their curiosity into unease. Daniel reached out, his hand brushing the surface, leaving a streak in the dust that revealed a darker fabric beneath. He tried to lift it, but the weight resisted, heavier than clothes or linen should allow. The handle groaned against his pull, the metal threatening to snap. Sarah knelt beside him, her palm pressed to the top of the case. She imagined who might have left it there, and why it had remained untouched through the years when the rest of the house had fallen into disrepair. The floor beneath it creaked ominously, the sag more noticeable now that their attention was fixed on it. For a moment, she worried the entire corner might collapse. "Leave it," Daniel whispered, though his voice carried no conviction. He tried again, shifting the suitcase slightly toward the center where the boards felt sturdier. The scrape of its metal corners echoed to the rafters, sharp and intrusive against the attic silence. Sarah steadied the flashlight, watching the lock glint faintly through a layer of grime. It was not an ordinary clasp, but something more deliberate, a small mechanism that seemed designed to resist idle hands. The suitcase sat between them, dust rising with each movement, the air thick with the sense that they had uncovered something that was never meant to be found. They did not open it that day, but neither could they look away from it. The house felt different now, no longer just an inheritance of weathered beams and empty rooms. It carried a secret, and in that secret was a weight they had not expected to shoulder. The attic waited above them, patient, as if the suitcase had been listening for decades for the sound of footsteps returning. The following morning, sunlight filtered weakly through the narrow attic window, catching particles of dust that never seemed to settle. Sarah and Daniel climbed the steep stairs again, their footsteps slower than the day before, each carrying a hesitation that came from thinking overnight about what they had discovered. The suitcase had lingered in their minds all through dinner, its stubborn weight and locked clasp pressing into their thoughts like an unanswered question. Now, in the pale light, it looked less like forgotten luggage and more like a deliberate hiding place. Daniel crouched beside it first, brushing his hand across the canvas surface. The fabric was mottled with mildew, stiff where moisture had eaten into its weave, and softer in patches that looked almost burned from time. The corners bore brass fittings, once polished perhaps, now corroded into dark green crust that flaked beneath his touch. Sarah knelt opposite him, holding the flashlight even though daylight touched the attic. The beam revealed the suitcase's lock, a mechanism neither of them recognized. It was no simple padlock or latch. The clasp was thick, built into the case itself, with a dial of worn numbers half obscured by grime. The edges showed faint engravings that seemed too ornate for ordinary travel gear. Someone had taken care to ensure the suitcase could not be opened easily. Sarah traced the numbers with her finger, feeling the grit of rust. Too heavy for clothes, Daniel said quietly, lifting one side just enough to feel the resistance. The handle groaned, the strain carrying through the attic boards. He let it down carefully, as though the weight could splinter the floor at any moment. Could be tools, could be books. But even as he said it, his voice faltered. The heft suggested something denser, something chosen to remain hidden in this place for decades. Sarah tilted her head, pressing her ear against the canvas. Inside, nothing shifted. No rattle, no slosh, no hint of contents moving. It felt solid, packed in a way that suggested purpose. She drew back, uneasy at the silence within. "It's sealed like someone didn't want anyone touching it," she murmured. Daniel tried turning the dial, its teeth grinding against rusted grooves. The numbers barely moved. Each effort left a metallic scrape in the air that felt louder than it should have, echoing off the rafters. He stopped, flexing his sore fingers. "It's jammed, maybe frozen from age." His words carried frustration, but underneath was something closer to dread. They sat back on their heels, studying it as though distance might provide an answer. Around them, the attic seemed to grow colder. The rafters creaked with a winter wind, and somewhere below a door slammed faintly from a draft. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, not entirely from a chill. She remembered the lawyer's dry tone when handing her the deed, his lack of surprise that no one else in the family had wanted the house. She wondered if he had known about this, or if it had waited unseen for so long that only they had finally stumbled upon it. Daniel fetched a screwdriver from the toolbox they had brought for small repairs. He wedged it beneath the clasp, pressing with steady pressure. The lock resisted. The canvas groaned but did not tear. Each attempt left his knuckles scraped against the corroded brass. Sarah held the light steady, watching dust fall from the boards above as though the house itself disapproved. After several minutes, Daniel let the tool fall with a clatter, his breath clouding in the cold air. "Not coming open like this," he admitted. "We'll need something heavier." His words hung between them, heavier still than the suitcase itself. Forcing it meant commitment, a choice to cross from curiosity into intrusion. Sarah considered leaving it, burying it again beneath boxes and old quilts, pretending it had never caught their eye. But her gaze kept returning to the engraved dial, the locked clasp that suggested a story sealed away. She brushed dust from the suitcase once more, her palm lingering on the stiff canvas. The mildew smell clung to her skin, acrid and unpleasant. "It's strange," she whispered. "Why lock something up here, in a house no one lived in for decades?" Daniel didn't answer. He only stared at the clasp, as though the rust itself held an answer he couldn't quite read. The suitcase remained between them, a mute presence in the dim attic light, its silence heavier than its weight. Whatever it held, they knew it had not been meant for casual discovery. Yet it was theirs now, a burden inherited along with the house, waiting for the moment they chose to break it open. The day after they found the locked suitcase, Sarah and Daniel decided to walk into town. The grocery store was their first stop, a narrow shop with wooden floors and shelves that leaned slightly to one side. The bell above the door rang as they entered, and the conversations of 3 customers seemed to pause in the same instant. Strangers turned their heads, then quickly returned to their baskets. But the glances lingered. The Whitaker name was not well known in Vermont anymore, but the house was. The cashier, a woman in her 60s with silver hair tied back in a braid, greeted them politely enough. Her eyes, however, flicked toward the reusable bags Sarah carried, and then to the car keys in Daniel's hand. "You're staying at the old Langley place?" she asked, as though she already knew the answer. Daniel nodded, offering a smile that faltered when her expression tightened. "That house has been empty near 40 years, she went on. "Strange place to want to settle down." Sarah tried to change the subject by asking about local bread, but the cashier was not done. "People said Harold Langley walked out of there in 77 and never came back. Left the lights on, food on the table. Sheriff called it a disappearance, but folks around here never like to talk too much about it." She lowered her voice even though no one was close. Some things in that attic never should have been touched. They carried their groceries back in silence, the weight of the bags nothing compared to the words still pressing on them. Daniel placed the milk and bread in the car, but his mind was elsewhere. Sarah sat for a moment with her hands resting on the steering wheel, thinking of the suitcase and the lock that had resisted them. She wanted to dismiss the story as rural rumor, but the certainty in the woman's voice stayed with her. Later that afternoon, they stopped at the hardware store to ask about tools for the repairs the house badly needed. The man behind the counter, broad-shouldered with grease still under his nails, seemed friendly at first. But when Daniel mentioned their address, the man's posture shifted. He leaned against the counter, arms folded, and gave a short laugh that carried no humor. "You'll want more than hammers for that place," he said. "I worked there once, back when I was a kid helping my uncle patch roofs. We never finished the job. Langley sent us away halfway through, paid cash, told us not to come back, said he'd handle it himself. Then he vanished. House hasn't been right since." Daniel tried to press for details, but the man shook his head. "All I'll say is don't spend too much time in that attic. Folks say he kept things up there he didn't want anyone seeing. My uncle used to joke the house had a memory, and it didn't like being disturbed. We laughed then, but after he died, I started thinking maybe he wasn't joking at all." By the time they returned to the house, dusk had settled, stretching the shadows of the trees long across the yard. Sarah carried the bags inside, her steps echoing in rooms still half empty. Daniel lingered on the porch, looking at the second-floor windows where the attic hatch lay just beyond. He thought of the cashier's whisper and the hardware man's warning, both circling back to the same place. The attic, the suitcase, the silence that had met them when they lifted it. At dinner, they spoke little, their words short and careful, as though talking too much about what they had heard might give it more power. The house creaked in the wind, timbers shifting in their long, tired rhythm. Sarah caught herself glancing at the ceiling, imagining the weight of the suitcase above them pressing down. When darkness finally covered the fields and the house settled into night, they sat by the fireplace, watching the last logs burn. Daniel broke the silence first. "They all knew something," he said. "They didn't say it outright, but they wanted us to stay away." Sarah nodded slowly, her eyes on the flames. "Maybe that's exactly why we can't," she replied. The words came softly, but they carried the stubbornness that had drawn her into the attic in the first place. Whatever had been hidden, Whatever had been left untouched for decades was now part of their lives. The neighbors could whisper all they wanted, but the suitcase waited, locked and silent, and the house would not let them forget it. The suitcase sat in the middle of the attic floor, a stubborn weight that seemed to absorb the dim light filtering through the single window. Sarah and Daniel had dragged it from the corner the evening before, determined to face it instead of leaving it half buried in dust. They had set an old sheet beneath it to protect the weakened boards, but nothing could soften the impression that the case itself carried its own gravity, an anchor left deliberately in a place where no one was meant to find it. Daniel knelt beside it first, a hammer in his hand, the kind of tool better suited for hanging shelves than for prying open history. He pressed the claw against a rusted clasp, levering gently, then harder. The metal groaned but held firm, the handle digging into the canvas as though the entire suitcase had stiffened to resist intrusion. Each attempt left a bright scratch across the corroded brass, shallow and useless. The lock seemed designed for more than travel, as if its maker had intended for it to endure far longer than a journey from one city to another. Sarah crouched beside him, her breath stirring the dust that clung to the air. She held the flashlight steady, the beam catching the edges of his effort, watching the marks grow without progress. When he paused, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cold, she took the screwdriver from the toolbox they had carried up. Its flat head slid beneath the clasp with a squeal of metal against metal. She pressed, twisting, but the lock refused to budge. The blade bent slightly, surrendering before the mechanism did. They exchanged a glance, neither willing to voice a thought that perhaps it was meant never to be opened. Daniel tried again, this time with pliers, clamping down on the dial to wrench it sideways. The rust flaked in small showers, scattering across the sheet like brittle confetti. The numbers shifted by a fraction before the tool slipped, gouging his knuckles. Blood welled, bright against the dust on his skin. He sucked in a sharp breath, shaking his hand, the sting of it adding to frustration that had already begun to settle. Sarah wrapped his hand with a rag, her eyes flicking back to the suitcase even as she tied the knot. Its silence felt mocking, a mute defiance that made her want to strike it. Instead, she picked up the hammer herself, testing the weight. With a firm swing, she brought the claw down, the impact sending a dull thud through the attic. The lock shuddered but remained. Another blow left only a dent in the brass, deep enough to scar, shallow enough to taunt. She lowered the hammer, her arms trembling from the effort. For a long moment, they both sat back, listening to the house around them. The rafters creaked. The wind pressed against the roof, and below, the old plumbing knocked faintly in the walls. The suitcase was the only thing that did not yield, its presence as immovable as the foundation stones in the cellar. Daniel leaned against a beam, his breathing heavy. "It's not just a lock," he muttered. "It's a warning." Sarah traced a dent with her finger, feeling the sharp edge where metal had buckled. She wondered what kind of person had sealed it so tightly, and what they had believed was worth protecting in an attic no one visited. Her imagination darted between possibilities: documents, money, weapons, something darker. Each felt plausible. Each made the resistance of the lock more unsettling. They tried once more, this time working together. Daniel held the case steady while Sarah wedged the screwdriver beneath the clasp again, hammering it with careful taps to drive the blade deeper. The metal groaned, shifted, then settled back as though sighing at their persistence. When the screwdriver finally snapped, the broken piece fell onto the sheet with a small, decisive clink that echoed too loudly in the quiet space. Defeated for the moment, they leaned back, staring at the battered clasp. It bore scratches now, dents from their efforts, but it remained closed. The suitcase looked wounded yet undefeated, a thing that had endured decades of silence and was prepared to endure more. As they packed their tools back into the box, Sarah whispered what they had both begun to suspect. "It doesn't want to open." Her words hung in the attic air, heavy and strange, but neither of them corrected her. They climbed down the stairs, leaving the suitcase in its place, its scarred lock glinting faintly in the shadows, as though it had been waiting for them to try and fail. The lock gave way on a Thursday evening. Daniel had returned from the hardware store with a set of heavier tools, the kind that looked less like instruments of repair and more like weapons. The attic light flickered weakly as they worked. Sarah kneeling on the sheet, Daniel crouched low with a crowbar wedged against a dented clasp. His arm strained, the rusted metal shrieking in protest before it snapped with a sound that was almost too sharp for the small space. For a moment, neither of them moved, the silence after the break thick and unsteady, as if the house itself were waiting. Then it came, a faint odor at first, barely noticeable over the dust and mildew, but enough to still their breaths. It wasn't the sharpness of mold or the dry tang of rust. This was heavier, sour and lingering, the kind of smell that lived in fabric long after its origin had passed. Sarah's stomach turned before she could even place it. Daniel leaned back quickly, covering his mouth with the crook of his arm. The crowbar clattered against the floorboards, the sound absorbed by the damp air. Sarah pulled the suitcase open slowly, her fingers trembling despite herself. The hinges groaned as if reluctant to move, dust lifting in small clouds that mixed with the odor. Inside lay folds of canvas, layered and deliberate, each one pressed flat as though someone had packed them with care. The fabric was gray with age, the edges stiff, the smell seeping from their seams. She reached out, pinched the corner of the first fold, and lifted. A soft tearing noise escaped as the brittle material separated from itself, releasing a stronger wave of the odor beneath. Daniel stopped her with a hand on her wrist. His eyes met hers, wide and uneasy. "Something's wrong," he said, his voice muffled behind his sleeve. But Sarah couldn't stop looking into the suitcase. The layers of canvas were stacked too neatly, too deliberate to be discarded rags. They formed a cover, a barrier between the lock and whatever lay deeper. She peeled the first layer aside, then another. Dust coated her hands, clinging to the sweat at her palms. Beneath the second fold, the outline of something solid pressed against the remaining fabric. The smell grew thicker as they worked, clinging to their clothes, creeping into their throats. Daniel fetched a pair of gloves from the toolbox, pulling them on with hands that shook more than he cared to admit. With both of them working, the layers came apart faster. Each revealed another, as though the case had been built not to carry but to conceal. By the fourth fold, the air was heavy enough to force them to open the attic window. The cold November wind rushed in, carrying away little of the stench. Beneath the canvas was weight, solid, immovable, something that shifted only slightly when Daniel pressed against it. They couldn't see its full shape yet, only the hard curve of a surface wrapped in cloth that had darkened with time. The smell seemed to radiate from that hidden mass, a sickly perfume that made Sarah step back, her hand covering her mouth. She wanted to leave it, to close the suitcase and shove it back in the corner where it had rested for decades. But the damage was already done. The lock had broken, the seals had been breached, and the thing inside had been given air again. Daniel tore away the last of the canvas with a grim determination, the sound harsh and final. Beneath, something heavy knocked against the base of the suitcase, thudding with a weight that made the floor groan. Sarah shone the flashlight into the cavity, the beam catching only cloth and shadows, but the outline beneath was clear, a solid form, too large a space, pressed into the suitcase as if forced there. The smell rolled out in waves, undeniable now, the scent of decay that no amount of canvas could fully contain. Neither spoke. The attic seemed to tighten around them, the rafters pressing lower, the silence between the wind gusts stretching too long. Daniel lowered the crowbar to the floor, his gloves stained with fragments of the brittle cloth. Sarah stepped back until her shoulders brushed the wall. They did not yet know what they had uncovered, only that it was heavier than either of them had expected and older than anyone had wanted to remember. The suitcase remained open, the broken lock dangling like a wound. The odor filled the attic, marking every surface it touched, refusing to fade even as the cold air poured through the open window. Whatever lay hidden beneath the last folds would not stay hidden much longer, and both of them knew they could not turn away now. The first things Daniel pulled free were flat and brittle, their edges curled from years pressed beneath the heavy canvas. At first he thought they were scraps of paper, nothing more than waste that had sifted down to the layers of time. But as he held one toward the light, an image revealed itself. A photograph, its surface yellowed and spotted, the corners torn as if it had been handled too often. He brushed away the dust with the back of his glove, careful not to tear further. A child looked back at him. The boy sat in a high-back chair, his legs too short to touch the floor. He wore a starched shirt buttoned tight at the throat, hair parted with precision. The face should have been ordinary, but the eyes had been scratched out with something sharp, leaving only pale grooves that caught the light. Daniel handed it to Sarah without a word, his hand lingering as though the paper carried weight beyond its size. She turned it over. The back bore no name, no date, only a smear of ink that had long since bled into the paper. Another photograph lay beneath it in the suitcase. Then another. Sarah drew them out carefully, spreading them across the sheet. Each one showed a family group, posed stiffly before backdrops of parlors, gardens, or blank studio walls. The men stood rigid, jackets buttoned, hair slicked flat. The women rested their hands on children's shoulders, expressions unsmiling, eyes fixed on the lens. But in many of the pictures, those eyes were not whole. Some had been scratched away like the boys'. Others bore heavy black ink slashes across the faces, as if someone had tried to erase the people without destroying the photograph itself. In one, an entire row of seated children had their faces marred, while the adults behind them remained untouched. Sarah felt her throat tighten as she studied the damage. It was deliberate, purposeful, and chilling in its precision. Daniel picked up a larger image, the paper cracking along its folds. A man stood alone, one hand resting on a table, the other at his side. He appeared middle-aged, his hair graying at the temples, his suit neat but plain. His eyes had not been scratched out, yet there was something unsettling in the way he seemed to look directly into the present across decades, as though he had been waiting for someone to hold this photograph again. Daniel quickly set it down, unwilling to meet that gaze any longer. The stack of photographs seemed endless. Some were cabinet cards mounted on stiff cardboard, their studio names half legible. Others were smaller, cut unevenly, edges jagged. None of the faces were familiar to Sarah. She searched each one for resemblance, for some trace of family connection, but nothing appeared. These were not her relatives, not people who belonged to her family's history. They were strangers. Yet someone had hidden them in this suitcase, wrapped them in layers of canvas, locked them away. She tried to arrange them into some kind of order. The children appeared in multiple photographs, sometimes younger, sometimes older. A girl with braids, eyes gouged out in one image, stood whole in another, her expression solemn but intact. A man missing from one family portrait appeared again in the background of a garden photograph. The collection seemed less like random keepsakes and more like pieces of a larger puzzle, fragments of lives cataloged and then defaced. The smell still lingered in the attic, heavy and sour, but the photographs drew their attention more than the odor. Sarah brushed her fingers lightly across the surface of one card, feeling the grooves where the ink had cut into the eyes. Whoever had done this had pressed hard, driven by anger or something darker. She thought of the neighbors' warnings, of the woman at the grocery store lowering her voice to whisper about the attic. This was what they had meant. Not just abandonment, not just dust, but secrets sharpened to the point of violence. Daniel leaned back on his heels, staring at the spread before them. Why keep them, he asked quietly. If someone hated these people enough to do this, why not burn them? His words carried no expectation of an answer, only the weight of unease. Sarah shook her head, her eyes fixed on the scratched faces. Because destroying them wasn't the point, she said slowly. Someone wanted them hidden, but not gone. They wanted whoever found them to see what was done. The photographs remained scattered across the sheet, their damaged eyes catching the beam of the flashlight, reflecting it in faint, unsettling glimmers. Neither Sarah nor Daniel spoke again for a long while. The house was silent around them, but the images filled the air with something heavier than noise, a presence that seemed to seep from the past into their hands. They had opened the suitcase, but in doing so they had opened something else, something that had waited patiently in the dark for nearly half a century. Beneath the last of the photographs, the bottom of the suitcase revealed something heavier, thicker than the curled papers that had come before. Sarah reached in, her gloves brushing against leather that had survived the decades better than the fabric that surrounded it. She lifted it carefully, the weight pulling at her wrists, and placed it on the sheet beside the scattered photographs. It was a notebook, bound in cracked brown leather, its edges blackened with age, its spine stiff but intact. A brass clasp held it closed, less ornate than the one that had sealed the suitcase, but strong enough that it clicked when she eased it open. The first pages were blank, yellow but unmarked, as though time had burned away their ink. Farther in, the writing began. Daniel leaned closer, the flashlight steady in his hand as the faded script emerged. The handwriting was tight, deliberate, and nearly impossible to read at a glance. It wasn't a journal in the ordinary sense. Each line seemed coded, initials followed by numbers, sequences of letters punctuated by strange symbols. Some entries were underlined, others circled, the emphasis purposeful but without explanation. Sarah turned a page slowly, careful not to tear the brittle paper. The smell of mildew clung to it, sharp and unpleasant, but beneath that was a faint odor of ink, as though the words themselves still held life. "These aren't stories," she murmured. "They're records." Daniel scanned the entries, his eyes catching on certain details. A date written in the margin, October 12, 1973. Another, March 5, 1975. The years repeated often, the mid-70s appearing page after page, until the pattern of time seemed deliberate. Some lines included place names they recognized. Maple Street, the quarry on Hollow Road, the train depot long abandoned but still standing in the next town over. Each location was marked with initials and numbers, none of which made immediate sense. He whispered the names aloud, his voice low, as though afraid the walls might overhear. Each one belonged to a place that still existed, landmarks unchanged by the passing decades. To see them cataloged here, in a book that had slept in the attic for nearly half a century, was unsettling in a way the scratched photographs had not been. This was not just memory. It was record-keeping, a map of something that had unfolded quietly in familiar streets. Sarah found a section where the entries grew denser, entire pages covered in symbols that repeated like a private alphabet. Circles and triangles stood in place of words, while dots and lines divided the text into columns. In one corner, initials appeared repeatedly. HL. She touched the letters lightly with her finger. Harold Langley, she whispered. The name of the house's last known owner, the man who had disappeared in the 1970s. Daniel's breath caught as he read over her shoulder. Then this is his. They turned more pages, each one adding to the sense of deliberate secrecy. There were references to payments, numbers written with $signs, amounts crossed out and replaced. Sometimes they were followed by more initials, sometimes by locations. The quarry appeared again, this time beside a sum of 500. The depot, beside a larger figure, crossed out with a heavy stroke of ink. Sarah's pulse quickened as she realized they weren't simply looking at idle notes. This ledger had tracked something, money exchanged, places marked, names reduced to letters. At the back of the book, pressed flat against the inside cover, was a folded sheet. Sarah eased it free with both hands. It was a town map, crude but recognizable. Streets were labeled in cramped handwriting, landmarks noted in the same initials that filled the ledger. Small X's marked certain places, heavy with ink, their meaning impossible to ignore. Some were near the quarry, others by the depot, and one only a few blocks from where they now stood. Daniel exhaled slowly, the sound heavy in the stillness of the attic. This isn't just notes. It's a trail. They stare at the map, then at the ledger, the names and numbers staring back at them with mute insistence. The book had not been meant for strangers. It was a record of a man who had lived inside these walls, who had written in code because plain words would have been too dangerous. The photographs had carried a sense of cruelty, but the ledger carried intent. It suggested that whatever had been hidden in the attic was not random, but part of something that had once reached beyond the house, into the town itself. Sarah closed the ledger gently, the brass clasp clicking shut. The sound echoed faintly, final and cold. They sat in silence, the photographs scattered around them, the map between them, the suitcase gaping open like a wound. The attic felt smaller now, the air tighter, as though the house itself had drawn closer to listen. Whatever had begun here decades ago had not ended. The ledger made that certain. Its coded lines had carried the past into present, and now Sarah and Daniel held it in their hands. The ledger rested on the sheet between them, its clasp shut, but its weight still pressing into the room. Sarah reached back into the suitcase, her hands brushing against something coarse beneath the photographs and maps. The cloth felt heavier, thicker than the canvas layers they had already peeled away. She pulled at a corner, the fabric stiff with mildew, and exposed a glimpse of dark metal beneath. For a moment she thought it was another lock, another mechanism meant to seal the case further, but the shape resolved into something far more familiar. She drew the bundle out carefully, setting it on the sheet. Dust clung to the folds, the smell of rot still hanging in the air. Daniel crouched close, his eyes fixed on the outline pressing through the fabric. Together, they peeled it back, the cloth tearing where dampness had eaten through. Inside lay a pistol, its barrel long, its grip darkened with rust. The metal was scarred but intact, the trigger stiff when Daniel tested it with a gloved hand. It looked as though it had been used and then hidden, sealed away with the same deliberation as the photographs and the ledger. Another bundle lay beside it, smaller but equally heavy. Sarah pulled this one open to reveal a second pistol, almost identical in design, its chamber stiff but not broken. Both weapons had been wrapped with care, not discarded but preserved, as though their owner had intended for them to remain out of sight, but ready if ever needed again. Daniel turned one over, the rust catching the beam of the flashlight. The serial numbers along the barrel had been scratched, nearly obliterated, leaving shallow scars where digits once stood. Beneath the pistols, another parcel waited. This cloth was softer, lined with what looked like old velvet, though it had faded into a dull gray. Sarah lifted it with both hands, and the contents spilled gently onto the sheet. Metals clinked against each other, their ribbons frayed, their surfaces tarnished but still recognizable. She picked one up, brushing her thumb across the dull bronze star that emerged beneath the dust. The ribbon was striped but faded to near colorlessness. One after another, she lifted them from the pile. Campaign medals, service bars, insignia that looked military but not all familiar. Some bore the eagle crest of the United States. Others symbols she could not place, foreign perhaps, or belonging to units no longer in existence. A few had been stored in small cases that had long since rotted apart, the leather flaking into powder around them. They glinted faintly in the dim light, as though the years had not fully dulled their meaning. Daniel leaned close, studying them with a frown. "These weren't for display," he said softly. "They were hidden, like the guns." He sifted through the metals, his gloved fingers lifting a silver cross whose back bore no engraving, only a blank plate where a name should have been. Another carried initials carved crudely, not by machine but by hand, as if someone had tried to claim it in secret. The pile seemed endless, metal spilling across the sheet until the fabric shimmered with dull metal. Sarah tried to count them, but the number blurred. Too many for one man, more than any single soldier could have earned in one lifetime. They did not feel like heirlooms passed down. They felt gathered, accumulated, then concealed. The attic was silent, except for the faint sound of the metals shifting under their hands. Each clink carried a strange finality, a reminder that someone had placed them here deliberately, choosing secrecy over recognition. Sarah sat back on her heels, her hand pressed against her mouth. She thought again of the neighbor's words, the cashier whispering about things best left untouched. This was what they had meant. Not just photographs, not just strange records, but weapons and honor stored away where no one was meant to see them. Daniel gathered the pistols and set them aside, their barrels angled away as though even rusted. They demanded respect. His eyes lingered on the metals, his brow furrowed. "Why hide these?" he asked, though the question was more to the addict than to Sarah. If he earned them, why not display them? If they were someone else's, why keep them at all? The suitcase had no answer. Its open mouth revealed only shadows, but both of them felt the weight of what they had uncovered. These were not ordinary keepsakes. They were evidence of something that had stretched beyond the walls of the house, into wars and histories they could not yet understand. The pistols lay rusted, the metals tarnished, but the purpose behind them felt untouched, sealed within the suitcase as tightly as a lock that had resisted them. Whatever story Harold Langley had meant to hide, it was unfolding piece by piece, and with each layer they pulled back, the attic grew heavier, as though the house itself was beginning to remember. The suitcase seemed nearly emptied, its contents spread across the sheet in chaotic order. The photographs with their mutilated faces, the ledger with its coded entries, the pistols rusted but intact, and the tarnished metals that caught what little light filtered to the attic window. Yet even with so much laid bare, the case itself carried a strange unfinished quality, as though what they had uncovered was only part of the story. Daniel noticed it first. Crouching low and tapping the base with his knuckle, the sound was wrong, a hollow echo where there should have been only the thud of solid lining. He tapped again, this time along the edges, and the difference became clearer. The bottom of the suitcase was not a single surface, but a thin layer masking another space beneath. Sarah leaned in, her eyes narrowing as she pressed her fingers against the lining. The fabric sagged slightly, more than it should have, and a faint outline of something rigid traced beneath the canvas. "There's something under it," she whispered, though Daniel had already reached the same conclusion. Together they turned the case, examining the seams where the lining met the sides. The stitches had long since frayed, but the material held stubbornly in place. It had been designed to appear seamless, an afterthought only noticeable if someone knew to look. Daniel fetched a utility knife from their toolbox, its blade glinting faintly in the weak light. He pressed the point carefully along the seam, slicing through the canvas with deliberate care. The sound of tearing fabric filled the attic, a rough whisper that seemed louder than it should have. The smell that escaped was different from the sour rot of the earlier layers. This was sharper, tinged with oil and old leather, as though the space beneath had preserved its own atmosphere for decades. The lining gave way in uneven strips, peeling back to reveal wood. A false panel lay across the bottom, fitted so neatly that it had vanished into the suitcase's structure. Daniel slipped the blade under its edge and pried gently. The wood resisted, groaning as though it resented being disturbed, then lifted with a sudden crack that sent a shiver up his arm. Beneath it lay a second compartment, shallow but dense, its contents packed tightly in bundles that had not seen light since the suitcase had first been sealed. Sarah lowered the flashlight, the beam falling across the layer below. Small parcels wrapped in wax paper lay stacked like bricks, their surfaces yellowed with age but still intact. Between them were envelopes, some sealed with brittle wax, their stamps foreign, their ink faded illegibility. A small tin rested on top, its lid dented, its label too worn to read. She lifted it gently, shaking it near her ear. The faint rattle of metal inside answered her. Daniel reached for one of the parcels, his gloves leaving smudges on the fragile wrapping. He pulled it apart slowly, the wax paper splitting along its folds. Inside lay rolls of currency, brittle but unmistakable. American bills, some so old they carry designs long out of circulation, others newer but water-stained and stiff. The stack was bound with twine, its knot pressed flat from years of compression. He set it down carefully, his breath shallow. "This isn't just memorabilia," he muttered. "It's money, hidden money." Sarah's hands trembled as she pulled free an envelope, the seal breaking with a dry snap. Inside were letters, written in the same tight hand as the ledger. She caught only fragments in the beam of the flashlight. Initials, numbers, coded language that mirrored the records they had already studied. Some were addressed to places in town. Others bore no addressee at all. One carried only a single word on its folded cover. Quarry. The deeper they dug into the compartment, the more the weight of it pressed on them. There were no trinkets here, no sentimental scraps. Every item had been hidden with precision, wrapped and packed to endure the years. The pistols and medals above had been one layer, perhaps a distraction, while the true secret had been sealed beneath. The false bottom, once invisible, now lay peeled back like a wound. Its contents glimmered faintly in the light, an unsettling mixture of wealth, secrecy, and intent. Sarah sat back on her heels, her breath unsteady, her eyes fixed on the bundles of cash and the coded letters. The photographs had been disturbing, the ledger incriminating, but this was different. This was proof that the house's last occupant had hidden more than memories. He had concealed something organized, something deliberate, something that reached beyond the attic silence. Daniel lowered the wood panel onto the sheet, its cracked edge sharp and splintered. He stared at the compartment for a long moment before speaking, his voice quiet but certain. He built this so no one would ever find it. And now we have. The attic felt closer with each passing second, the air heavy with the mingled odors of mildew, oil, and old paper. The suitcase no longer seemed like an object they had uncovered, but a threshold they had crossed. and what lay beneath its false bottom was not finished with them yet. The bundles of money and envelopes lay scattered across the sheet, their fragile paper whispering when moved. Daniel had been shifting them carefully aside, stacking the wax parcels so they would not collapse under their own age. Sarah was about to lift another when her hand brushed something different. Something not wrapped in crisp lines of paper, but in soft folds that had long since decayed. The fabric crumbled beneath her touch, releasing a faint puff of dust and a smell unlike the others. It was not the acrid odor of mildew, nor the sharp tang of oil. It was older, drier, carrying with a finality that made her draw back. Daniel crouched beside her, his flashlight steady. The beam caught the bundle's surface, showing cloth that had once been thick, but was now rotted, its weave fragile as cobwebs. Unlike the parcels of money, this one sagged in the middle, its shape uneven, not rectangular. Sarah's fingers hesitated above it, trembling slightly. She did not want to touch it again, but Daniel reached forward and lifted the edge of the cloth. It gave way with little resistance, flaking apart as if it had been waiting for this moment. Beneath, something pale glimmered in the light. At first it looked like ivory, smooth and curved, but the shape resolved into something unmistakable. A bone no larger than a forearm, its ends fragile, one side still wrapped in tatters of fabric that clung like skin. Sarah covered her mouth with both hands, the sound of her breath sharp in the stillness. Daniel froze, the cloth dangling from his fingers. The flashlight beam wavered but remained fixed on the shape. He shifted the fabric back further, revealing more of it. The remains were small, delicate, the size of a child's arm. The bones were dry, stripped of any flesh, but they carried the unmistakable fragility of youth. A humerus, an ulna, the tiny arc of finger bones still faintly connected by dried sinew. The sight of them pulled the attic into silence, so deep that even the wind seemed to hold back. Neither of them spoke. The suitcase, already heavy with secrets, had turned into something else entirely. It was no longer a container of photographs or money or medals. It was a grave. Sarah's knees gave way and she sat back against the wall, her eyes locked on the bundle. She wanted to deny it, to claim the bones were something else. Animal remains, scraps of ivory, anything but what they were. But the shape was too clear, too human. Daniel lowered the cloth gently, covering the bones again, though the outline remained. His face had lost its color, his jaw clenched tight. He looked at the ledger lying nearby. The photographs with their scratch faces, the medals piled in dull clusters. Together, they formed a picture neither of them wanted to see. The ledger had recorded dates and initials. The photographs had cataloged strangers, children with their eyes erased. Now, here in the bottom of the suitcase was something that bound those fragments to something far darker. Sarah pressed her palms against her temples, her heart racing. She thought of the neighbors' whispers, the hardware clerk's half-joking warning, the grocery woman's quiet voice speaking of things better left untouched. They had all known, or at least suspected. They had lived with the shadow of this house and chosen not to climb its attic stairs. And now she and Daniel had forced it open, brought its silence to light. Daniel sat heavily beside her, his gaze fixed on the suitcase. "This isn't just evidence of something hidden," he said at last, his voice low and strained. "This is a crime. This is—" He cut himself short, unable to finish. The words hung unspoken, but Sarah felt them as clearly as if he had shouted them. The attic air pressed down on them, thick with dust and the lingering smell that had seeped from a bundle. Sarah closed her eyes, but the image remained, stark against the darkness behind her lids. A child's bones bound in cloth, sealed away in a suitcase for nearly 50 years. No explanation, no name, only silence and decay. They sat together without speaking, the weight of what they had uncovered pressing harder than the beams above their heads. The suitcase was no longer an artifact of family inheritance or forgotten history. It was something far more personal, something that carried with it the unbearable responsibility of knowledge. The bones had been hidden to stay unseen, but now they had been found, and neither Sarah nor Daniel could pretend otherwise. The attic felt smaller than ever, its shadows tighter, its silence unbroken except for the sound of their breathing. The suitcase remained open at their feet, its false bottom exposed, its secret unwrapped. The house had finally revealed what it had been guarding all these years, and the truth was something neither of them could put back. The bones lay wrapped again in their rotted cloth. But the image would not leave them. Sarah kept her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as though holding herself together. Daniel had closed the suitcase, pressing the false bottom back into place as best he could, though the crack would refuse to fit neatly anymore. It looked clumsy now, a cover that could no longer disguise what was hidden beneath. The attic was thick with the odor that had risen when they uncovered the bundle, a sourness that clung to the air and seemed to settle into their clothes. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Sarah's eyes stayed fixed on the floorboards, her chest rising and falling too quickly. The photographs with their scratched faces were still scattered across the sheet. The ledger sat closed beside them, and the metals glinted faintly in the failing light from the attic window. But all of it had changed now. None of it could be dismissed as strange relics or unsettling curiosities. The bones had shifted everything. They were no longer simply heirs to an old house. They were standing above a crime scene. Daniel rubbed his hands over his face, leaving streaks of dust across his skin. His voice, when it came, was low and rough. "We can't ignore this," he said. "You know what this means." Sarah shook her head quickly, as though the words themselves were too heavy to accept. "We don't know what it means," she answered. "It could be anything. It could be older than the house. Maybe it's not even." She stopped herself, the denial faltering before it could form. She had seen the delicate curve of the bones, the size too small to belong to any adult. She knew what they had uncovered, even if she refused to speak it. Daniel leaned back against the beam, the wood creaking beneath him. "We have to call someone. The police, the sheriff. This isn't ours to handle." Sarah looked up at him sharply, her voice quick and tense. "And what happens then? They take the house. They tear everything apart. They question us like we're suspects. Do you think they'll care that we just found it? This will follow us. Daniel, this will stain us." He held her gaze, his jaw tight. "What's the alternative? We pretend we didn't see it? Seal it back up and go on living here? Sleep under the same roof as that suitcase and act like nothing happened?" His words carried frustration, but beneath it was fear, the kind that stiffened his shoulders and made his eyes too bright. Sarah hugged her knees to her chest, her back pressed to the wall. "This was supposed to be a fresh start," she whispered. "We were supposed to make this house ours. Fix it, live in it. Not—" Her voice trailed away, unable to finish. Daniel pushed himself to his feet, pacing the narrow stretch of floor. The flashlight beam swung with his movement, catching the edges of the photographs, the scratches across the children's faces glinting like wounds. "It was never a clean house," he muttered. "It was never just an inheritance. Everyone in town tried to warn us. We just didn't listen." Silence settled again, broken only by the shifting of the old rafters in the wind. Sarah's thoughts churned with images she could not stop replaying. The gouged photographs, the coated ledger, the medals that belonged to too many men, and now the fragile bones wrapped like discarded belongings. Each piece alone might have been strange, but together they formed something unbearable. Finally she spoke, her voice unsteady. "If we call them, everything changes. If we don't, we have to live with it. Either way, we don't get the life we thought we'd have here." Daniel stopped pacing. He stared at her, his shoulders tense, his face drawn. "Maybe the life we thought we'd have was never ours to begin with," he said quietly. His words carried no anger, only resignation. They sat in the attic until the daylight faded completely, neither willing to climb down, neither willing to make the call. The suitcase lay closed at their feet, its contents unspoken but undeniable, a weight heavier than the house itself. The silence stretched between them, fragile and sharp, as they faced the truth that their inheritance had become something they could not escape, no matter what choice they made next. The decision came long after dark. They had left the attic hours before, but the house gave them no peace. Sarah tried sitting by the fireplace, a blanket around her shoulders, staring into flames that gave no warmth. Daniel had paced the length of the kitchen, his boots scuffing the warped floorboards, circling from stove to door and back again. Every sound of the old house, the groan of the beams, the knock of the pipes, pressed harder than usual, as if the house itself knew what they had seen and was waiting for their next move. The suitcase might have remained above them, sealed again beneath its splintered panel. But its presence seemed to have spread into every room. They could not look at the ceiling without thinking of it. Daniel had argued for hours that they could not keep this to themselves. Sarah had resisted, imagining the intrusion of uniforms, strangers combing through their inheritance, neighbors whispering even louder than before. Yet her reasons weakened each time the memory of the bones returned, wrapped in cloth, small enough to fit in her hands. Denial no longer protected her. The suitcase did not contain just secrets but evidence, and evidence demanded to be answered. It was near midnight when she found herself holding the phone, her fingers trembling. The glow of the screen lit her face in the darkened room. Daniel stood behind her, his hands braced on the back of the chair she sat in, his silence heavy with the weight of expectation. She looked at the numbers, her breath shallow, then pressed them one by one. Each beep sounded far too loud in the stillness. The line clicked and a voice answered, calm and practiced. 911, what's your emergency? For a moment, Sarah could not speak. Her throat felt dry, her words caught in the tightness of her chest. Daniel leaned closer, urging her softly, tell them. She closed her eyes and forced her voice into the receiver, though it came thin and unsteady. We found something. In our house. The dispatcher's tone shifted, more alert. What exactly did you find, ma'am? Sarah's mouth opened, but the words would not come. She heard herself whisper, bones, human bones. The silence that followed on the line seemed to stretch too long, though it was only a second before the voice returned. Where you located? The dispatcher asked. Sarah gave the address with clipped syllables, her voice breaking once as she stumbled over the street name. The dispatcher repeated it back to her carefully, then continued. Are the remains secure? Has anyone else been in the house? Daniel motioned for the phone, and she passed it to him with shaking hands. His voice was steadier, but even he kept it brief. The bones were in a suitcase in the attic, along with photographs, documents, weapons. We haven't touched them since. No one else knows but us. He paused, listening. Yes. Well, wait. He ended the call and placed the phone flat on the table, his hand resting over it as if to keep it from moving again. Sarah pressed her palms into her eyes, her breath coming fast. They're coming here, she whispered. Daniel nodded, his expression drawn. The house seemed to shift with the knowledge that others would soon arrive. Its silence grew sharper, the shadows in the corners darker. Sarah imagined the sound of sirens cutting through the stillness of the road, the flash of light spilling across the peeling walls. She imagined officers climbing the same attic stairs, shining their beams into the suitcase, pulling out what she had seen and tried not to see again. Neither of them spoke for the rest of the night. They sat together in the kitchen, the phone between them, the walls listening. The call had been brief, only a handful of words exchanged, but it had broken a boundary they had been trying to hold. The secret of the house was no longer theirs alone. The authorities were on their way, and the suitcase would no longer belong to silence. The first flicker of blue and red reached them through the kitchen window long before the sound. Sarah had been staring into the dark yard, listening to the house creak and sigh when the colors broke against the glass like water. Moments later came the low hum of engines and the crunch of tires on gravel. Daniel stood up from the table without a word, his chair scraping against the worn floorboards. Neither of them needed to speak. They knew the night they had tried to contain was about to spill open. 2 patrol cars pulled into the drive, their lights casting sharp shadows across the sagging porch and the leaning shutters. Behind them came a dark SUV, larger, its headlights sweeping across the yard and illuminating the brittle fence line. Sarah's breath caught when the doors opened and figures stepped out, their silhouettes marked by the reflective strips on their jackets. Officers fanned out quickly, purposeful in their movements, their radios murmuring as they surveyed the property. The air carried the clipped rhythm of procedure, voices low but efficient. Daniel opened the door before they could knock. The nearest officer, a woman with a flashlight in one hand, introduced herself, her voice firm but not unkind. She asked them to wait inside while the others secured the perimeter. Yellow tape stretched across the porch posts, curling in the wind, a visible mark that the house no longer belonged entirely to them. Sarah watched from the window as one officer walked the line of the property, fixing the tape to trees and posts, sealing them into a space that was now defined not as a home, but as a scene. When the investigators arrived, their presence shifted the air further. They carried cases of equipment, their gloves already pulled on, their expressions unreadable. Without hesitation, they asked to be taken to the attic. Sarah's feet felt heavy as she led the way, the beam of their lights cutting through the hall and up the narrow staircase. The hatch groaned open again, and the cold air of the attic greeted them with the same smell that had refused to leave since the suitcase had been opened. The suitcase at where they had left it, the false bottom still cracked and askew. The sheet beneath was scattered with the objects they had pulled free, the photographs of their mutilated eyes, the ledger with its clasp shut, the pistols dull with rust, and the metals dulled but still catching the flashlight beams. The investigators did not hesitate. They crouched, opened their cases, and began lifting each item with gloved hands, placing them carefully into labeled bags. Cameras flashed in the dim attic, capturing every angle, every object, every scar of dust and rust. Sarah stood back, pressed against the sloping wall, her arms wrapped tight around herself. She watched the photographs disappear one by one into evidence bags, their scratched faces no longer staring upward. Daniel stood beside her, silent, his jaw rigid, his hands locked behind his back as though restraining himself from interfering. The investigators moved methodically, cataloging, recording, sealing, until the sheet was cleared. When they reached the false bottom, they pried it fully loose, the splinter wood giving way in their hands. The bundle wrapped in rotted cloth was lifted with a gentleness that made Sarah's breath hitch. Even before the fabric fell aside, the investigators exchanged looks that carried quiet certainty. The bones, so small and fragile, were cradled into a container, wrapped and sealed with the care given not to artifacts but to remains. The air grew heavier, and Sarah turned her face toward the rafters, unable to watch the moment the bundle disappeared into a bag marked with codes she could not decipher. One of the officers asked them to step aside as they continued their work. They obeyed, retreating to the top of the stairs, listening to the muffled voices and the clicks of cameras. Every sound from the attic seemed to echo louder than it should, each word another nail closing off their fragile sense of ownership of the house. The attic was no longer theirs, and neither were its secrets. When the investigators finally descended, carrying their sealed evidence, the weight of their footsteps seemed to shake the entire house. Boxes, bags, and the suitcase itself passed through the hallway, down the stairs, and out into the waiting vehicles. Sarah watched from the doorway as each item was loaded carefully, the flashing lights outside throwing brief glimpses of the objects before they vanished into the dark interiors of the cars. By the time the attic was cleared, the house felt hollow. The suitcase was gone, but its absence pressed harder than its presence had. The tape still fluttered in the wind, the patrol cars idled with steady hums, and the yard was lit in strobes of color that felt more final than any words. Sarah and Daniel stood together on the porch, their shoulders brushing but their hands apart, watching as strangers carried away the pieces of the mystery they had inherited. The house they had thought might become their beginning had been marked instead as an ending, and neither of them could imagine what it would feel like when the lights finally disappeared down the road. The flashing lights had faded by dawn, leaving only the hushed presence of detectives in plain clothes. They sat with Sarah and Daniel at the kitchen table, paper spread between coffee cups gone cold. The yellow tape still fluttered outside the windows, a reminder that the property no longer belonged to its owners. What remained inside was silence, punctuated only by the detectives' measured voices as they explained what little they knew. One of them, a man with gray at his temples and a voice that carried the weight of habit, spoke of old files buried in county records. In the mid-1970s, several missing person reports had surfaced. 2 children who had vanished walking home from school, a laborer who had been last seen at the train depot, a woman who had never returned from a visit to the market. None of the cases had ever been solved. Their names had been spoken in town for a time, then folded into silence, overshadowed by other troubles. Langley's name came up back then, the detective said, tapping his finger against the table. Not in charges, not in evidence, but in whispers. He lived here, kept to himself, and people noticed things. Lights at odd hours. Visitors who didn't belong. The other detective leaned forward, her eyes steady on the couple. She spoke of rumors that had followed the town for decades, a smuggling ring that operated quietly through Vermont's back roads, using abandoned quarries and old train lines to move what shouldn't be moved. Some said it was contraband liquor in the early days. Others believed it had turned to weapons or even people in the later years. None of it had ever been proved. No raids, no arrests, just stories repeated in half-trusted tones. But the ledger and the map found in the suitcase, she explained, carried echoes of those whispers. Initials, dates, amounts, records that suggested transactions. Places marked not for memory, but for exchange. Sarah sat with her arms folded tightly across her chest, listening but unable to let the words settle. Each piece added weight but no shape, like stones dropped into deep water. She thought of the ledger's cramped handwriting, the children's faces scratched from photographs, the medals that did not belong to one man alone. They formed fragments of a picture she could not see clearly, shards that cut without revealing the whole. Daniel pressed for answers, his voice sharper than he intended. So what are you saying? That this man, Langley, was involved? That he hid money, weapons? Even he trailed off before naming the bones they found, but the silence carried the word anyway. The detectives did not answer directly. They only reminded him that evidence takes time, that files had to be reopened, that experts would need to examine the remains. Sarah found herself staring at the notepad one of them had left open on the table. Dates and names jotted quickly, arrows drawn between them. But even the detective's notes looked uncertain. She realized then that the professionals who had stepped into their home carried no more clarity than she did. They had theories, patterns, suspicions, but no truth yet. When the detectives finally rose to leave, the house felt heavier for their absence. They promised updates, promised to call, but their careful language gave away the uncertainty. Nothing could be confirmed. Nothing could be resolved. The suitcase had opened a wound, but the infection of questions remained. After the door closed and the sound of their car faded, Sarah and Daniel sat again in silence. The kitchen still bore the smell of dust and mildew, as if the suitcase lingered even after being taken away. Sarah rubbed her hands against her sleeves, her eyes on the table where the papers had been. "They don't know," she whispered, almost to herself. "They don't know any more than we do." Daniel leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Maybe no one ever will. His words carried no bitterness, only the flat tone of resignation. The attic above them groaned in the morning wind, empty now, but its emptiness felt louder than the suitcase had. The questions had multiplied, but the answers had not arrived. Missing names from decades past, rumors of smuggling that blurred fact with fiction, objects hidden with deliberate care, but refusing to explain themselves. The suitcase had given them fragments of a story, but not its ending. All that remained was silence, and the growing sense that the truth had slipped through time, leaving behind only echoes too faint to follow. The attic was empty now. Where the suitcase had sat, there was only the square of a sheet stained with dust and fragments of fabric, the outline of objects that had been lifted carefully away. The floor creaked under Sarah's step as she entered, her eyes tracing the marks left behind. She had expected the space to feel lighter without the suitcase, as though its removal would release something from the house. But instead, the silence seemed denser. The air was colder, not with the draft of November, but with absence. Daniel followed her up the narrow stairs, ducking beneath the hatch. He carried no light this time. Enough beams had swept across these rafters already, the flash of cameras illuminating every cobweb, every warped board. Now the attic sat in natural dimness, the weak daylight spilling through the single window, dust turning in the beam like suspended ash. He stopped just inside, his gaze settling on the space where the investigators had crouched, their voices clipped, their gloved hands lifting what he and Sarah had found first. They did not speak at once. Words felt misplaced in a place that had already been stripped of them. Sarah pressed her hand against one of the beams, steadying herself. The wood felt colder than usual, as though it carried a memory of what had been discovered here. She looked at the floor and could still picture the suitcase, its corroded clasp, the dents they had made in their first attempt to pry it open. She saw the photographs spread across the sheet, the scratched faces catching the light. She remembered the ledger, its codes and initials, the metals clinking together in a dull chorus. And beneath all that, she remembered the cloth bundle, the pale curve of bone that had ended their attempts to explain it away. Daniel moved to the corner where they had first seen it, half hidden by sagging boards. He tapped the wood with his knuckle out of habit, listening for the hollowness they had once missed. The sound was solid now, ordinary, but it carried no comfort. He straightened, exhaling slowly. "It's strange," he said quietly, his voice nearly swallowed by the rafters. "The suitcase is gone, but it feels like it's still here." Sarah nodded, her throat tight. She understood. The weight of its presence had sunk into the house itself. Even without the objects, the attic seemed marked. No furniture or boxes could ever cover that square of space again without recalling what had been there. The investigators had bagged and tagged everything, but the attic still felt sealed, not by locks or panels, but by memory. They stood there for a long while, listening to the silence. The rest of the house was changing too. Downstairs, tape sealed the doorframes, evidence markers dotted the floorboards, and the faint smell of gloves and chemicals lingered where strangers had worked. Their home, which had seemed abandoned but theirs to reclaim, was now layered with official authority. It no longer belonged to them, not fully. The house was both inheritance and evidence, shelter and scene. Sarah walked slowly across the attic, her footsteps leaving faint prints in the dust the investigators had stirred. She knelt once, pressing her palm to the wood where the suitcase had rested. It was smooth, worn by weight, almost polished. She pulled her hand away quickly, wiping her palm against her jeans, unsettled by the thought that the house itself might be holding on to what had been placed here so many years ago. Daniel leaned against the beam, his arms folded. "Even if we fix the roof, paint the walls, fill this place with furniture," he said, his eyes on the window where light pushed weakly through, "this attic will always feel the same." Sarah didn't answer. She knew he was right. Some marks did not fade with repairs. She looked once more at the space, at the rafters stretching like ribs above them, and thought of the suitcase traveling now in the back of a dark vehicle, locked again but in a different way. The house remained, but it had been altered. Its silence was not emptiness, but something carried forward, something that refused to leave with the evidence. They descended at last, the hatch closing with its usual groan. But even as Sarah stepped back into the hallway, she felt the attic pressing above her, heavier now that it was empty. The suitcase was gone, but its secrets had seeped into the beams, into the very air of the house, and no amount of light or time would carry them away.